Welcome to Module 10. In this module, we consider the responses to Hegel as formulated by the Danish philosopher Kierkegaard and the German philosopher Marx. Though the two thinkers could not be more different, their work is directed at the same problem, the notion of progress and development as laid out by Hegel. Kierkegaard was a deeply religious thinker, the kind of religious that led him to reject the church of his state because he believed that they were no longer representing the true meaning of Christianity. He was Christian, though by his standards he was about the only one in Denmark. On his deathbed, when he was asked if a priest should be brought, he replied, "If you can find me a priest of God, not a priest of the state." This deep religious connection gave him some rather profound insights into human nature. We have already noted the importance of religious stories before, not as theology, but as representation of critical human ideas which have, because of that importance, managed to survive so long and seem to be a deep reflection of human psyche. Thus, although his ideas are religious, Kierkegaard's work has been taken up by philosophy, psychology, sociology, and science. One of the main claims introduced by Hegel was the idea that the goals of progress are attainable only by a race, not the individual. This is because Hegelian progress is measured in centuries, but the human contribution is measured in years or decades. Thus, the individual is irrelevant. Additionally, because Hegelian progress of history is inexorable, no individual can accelerate or stop it. Thus, humans only matter in the sense of the masses of humanity over numerous generations. Kierkegaard takes issue with this approach because the reduction of an individual to nothing is a problem for the individuals, which is all we can ever be. Additionally, in the Hegelian sense of history, with its seemingly infinite time frame, all human value is reduced to nothing. You can think of it this way. If you were a doctor, and you knew that no matter how hard you work to save a patient, they will die in the next hour, why would you bother trying to save them? What would be the point? Well, no matter how important the problem may be, how feverishly you work to resolve it, how great a success your solution is, you and everyone you know and love will be dead in 100 years. In about 4 billion years, the sun will swallow our planet. In a few trillion years, the universe will die a heat death. What's the point? The despair of Kierkegaard is something of a clinical assessment of the way people tend to break. Its accuracy is astonishing, especially given the fact that he described these conditions long before psychology caught on. Despair plays a central role in Kierkegaard's thought, so we will cover it briefly. The despair of infinitude is the problem of failing to connect yourself to reality. This despair manifests with deep caring for the world, but without care for the individuals of that world. It is marked with individuals who have ideas about what should be done, but never do anything because they're not grounded in the world. You can think of this as the people who post things on Facebook about the suffering of others, but never actually move to alleviate that suffering. The despair of finitude is the flip side of the previous issue, where the individual cannot get a perspective outside of their own head. They're just an infinitesimal part of reality. What can they do? They cannot challenge the social order, the suffering, the problems that plague them and the rest of humanity, so they simply abdicate all that responsibility and follow the masses wherever they may go. You can think of this as the people who quietly stand by as their neighbors commit atrocities, because what can a single person do? The despair of defiance is despair brought on by the idea that we are magically unique, that we decide our own values, that we are the center of the world. In its active form, the individual is uncommitted to the world and its structures. They are willing and able to turn on a dime and to be something completely different. This is an unstable position where one can always turn against whatever idea they have and rebel against any structure. But without commitment, there is no actual value given to anything. There is only a facade. When there is no value to the content, then having the ability to pick your content is pointless, because you only have the power to pick nothing of value. You can think of this as the various posers on social media or in politics who apparently change their stance according to whatever is popular at the moment. In its passive form, despair of defiance becomes outright genocidal. The inadequacies of the individual life, whatever they may be, and we all certainly have more than our fair share, these are our case against God and against the very idea of existence. One of the oldest religious stories is precisely a story of passive despair of defiance, the story of Cain and Abel. Cain's inadequacies lead to his offering being rejected. Then Cain complains to God, and we have this exchange. Quote, "The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it.'" This, of course, is followed by the very first murder. The thing to note is that Cain was not wronged by Abel. He wasn't even angry with Abel in the sense that Abel did something wrong. No, Cain was angry with the world because his effort was inadequately rewarded by his estimation. Abel was successful and represented all that Cain desired. He also represented what the Lord had blessed and looked favorably upon. Cain slew Abel despite God and God's creation. If God was willing to make such a stupid world where Cain suffers, then let it all burn. Kill the thing that represents success, and kill the reason why anyone would think the world is good. You can see this exact type of thinking in the various letters, manifestos, and other communication left by school shooters and others who take their rage at the world and aim it at random innocents. In mere depression, such a person might commit suicide, but they want the world to burn because it should, because what kind of a stupid world is it where this person has to suffer? It should all be burnt to the ground, and this is a terrifying kind of despair. Against the Hegelian irrelevance of the individual, Kierkegaard gives us three modes of human existence: the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The aesthetic mode of being is about the Hegelian immanence and is focused on the experience of pleasure and novelty. It is very important to note that true aesthetic mode of being cannot seek pleasure. It must be entirely submerged in the experience of pleasure. Why? Because as soon as we have goals, the pleasure is no longer imminent. It is a future pleasure that we dedicate ourselves to. The problem for the aesthete is that the immanence cannot last. It is a feature of the material world that nothing persists. Imagine a person who derives immense pleasure from watching a flower. That pleasure, by definition, must be short-lived, because the flower blooms and then decays. As soon as the decay sets in, it can no longer provide the needed pleasure, and the aesthete must seek a new pleasure. The aesthetic mode of being is also a static one. It attempts to simply be what it is. However, as soon as we introduce the idea of seeking pleasure, it is no longer a static act of being, because it is an act of becoming. You are not happy, and you seek to become happy. The ethical mode of being is centered on the idea of becoming. If the aesthete was the Hegelian immanence, the ethical person is the Hegelian idea of development. At this stage, a person decides on an object of pursuit and then dedicates themselves to this pursuit. This dedication is represented by the effort, commitment, and self-sacrifice in the pursuit. Unlike the aesthete's simple being, the ethical individual does not see the goal as an endpoint, but a permanent process, and thus their work is never complete. The problem of the ethical position is that the goal itself is essentially irrelevant. It's not about the goal, because the goal cannot be reached. It is about engagement in the pursuit of the goal, but that means that any goal could suffice. More critically, the issue of the ethical mode is that it is ultimately irrelevant, because all things end, and a lifetime's worth of dedication is empty of meaning when faced with the void of death and nothingness, which all humans face. And that means that when we make a choice, we are making it against the backdrop of the void that reduces all values to nothing. How do we make a choice then? Here, Kierkegaard introduces the third mode of being, the religious. The religious mode must go beyond the mere ethical mode, because the religious takes place beyond the limits of the material world, beyond the void of death and destruction. Kierkegaard presents us with the idea that to reach the religious mode of being, we have to throw ourselves into the void and hope that something is there to catch us, hope that it is not all for nothing. It bears noting that when Kierkegaard speaks about the religious, he is not speaking of the kinds of social custom that most people claim when they classify themselves as a religious person. That is mere empty ritual, backed by socialized mob mentality, and is unrelated to the religious mode as well as the notion of religious belief. Instead, religious belief is the greatest passion of all, which demands one's full attention, dedication, and embodiment. In short, a life fully lived as a representation of that belief. The levels of despair are why the aesthetic and the ethical modes are simply not enough. The only way out for Kierkegaard is through the religious mode, because in that mode he thinks that we become grounded in the value of the divine, and we are driven to be ourselves, recognized within those divine values. Finally, our very existence means that we choose which state we exist at. But we make that choice by necessity. There is no sitting this one out, because any choice at all, including the choice not to choose, is a choice. The problem, however, is that making this choice is not something that we can ever do rationally. The choice must be made without certainty of outcome. The only way we could have that certainty would be to judge the choice based on some external and objective standard. The issue is, even if such a standard exists, we do not have access to it and never will. To have that knowledge, we would have to have a perspective of someone who is standing outside the universe, outside of time and space, and who has infinite knowledge. You may want to note that this is the traditional definition of God. So, we have to make a choice, but we can never make it with good reason, because we have no idea which reasons are good. We have to make an assumption, and this is what Kierkegaard calls the leap. It must be a leap because you cannot get there by reason, for two reasons. First, we don't have an objective external standard by which to judge. Second, even if you had the knowledge to make the decision, Kierkegaard has noted that the point is not in the knowing, but in the embodying the idea with your very being. So all that knowledge, and you still get nothing. The leap is the act of embodying the dedication and a life commitment. A thing to note is that the system described here is a close match for the thought process we saw in Al-Ghazali's writing, namely that at the core of knowledge lies an assumption. The only way to come to know anything is by first making the leap, an assumption, that the meaning and value of your core assumptions about the world, like reason, are true. This leap is also a counterpoint to Hegel. Hegel's logical system of the world sees the goal as an endpoint. The present is merely a step in solving the equation that has already been determined. That's why the individual and existence is irrelevant, because it's all already settled. But Hegel cannot develop an existential system because the very act of existence means that the goal is not some endpoint, it is the process of becoming. The point Kierkegaard makes is that logical systems can be communicated and shared. That is why we can learn math. But the existential systems are subjective by definition. That means that you cannot communicate them. The Pope can tell you about his faith, but that is irrelevant for your faith, because faith is not about knowledge, but about embodying the idea. So the truth, which is the religious mode for Kierkegaard, cannot be communicated, at least not in the sense of being a universal system that makes people religious. You can think of it this way. Knowing how to diet and exercise to be healthy does not mean that you are dieting or exercising or being healthy. Knowledge does not necessarily translate into action. Again, Kierkegaard is drawing on some religious ideas. In the Old Testament and the New, it is only the individuals who come to the light. The masses are always, as a rule, not reached by the prophetic message. Thus, Kierkegaard quotes St. Paul when he says, "Only the one attains the truth." Kierkegaard focus on the individual. Marx took a radically different route. He starts off by acknowledging the Hegelian idea. In fact, he draws on 4 points. 1. History is the only significant factor. It's all about the development of culture and reason progressing forward, not about static eternal truths. 2. The opposition and antagonism are necessary factors for progress. 3. Goals are attained by a race, not individuals. And 4. Evil is justified by progress. All evil. Marx's big point is that Hegel gets the story backwards. It's not that some ultimate immaterial telos of history is pulling us forward. No, it's the material struggle of humanity that is pushing us. The difference is between immaterial and material causes, and between being drawn to a conclusion as opposed to pushing yourself there. Hegel famously remarks that the job of a philosopher is not to change the world, but to understand it. Marx says, to hell with that, philosophy is action. The antagonism, according to Marx, is always a class struggle between those who supply labor and those who own the means of production. Labor is supplied by the proletariat. The means of production are owned by the bourgeoisie. The antagonism culminates in a revolution or destruction of society. But this turns the Hegelian dialectic around. Instead of the spirit of history drawing us forward, inherently deciding what shall succeed and what shall fail, it is the success and failure of human force in the revolution that decides the outcome. You can think of it this way. Imagine you see a wealthy person. The Hegelian approach is to say that the universe works in mysterious ways. The Marxist approach is to say that the man got rich by exploiting others. The Hegelian idea leaves you without a way of getting rich because for the rich guy, it was luck. The Marxist idea gives you a path to get the wealth. Exploit people. The same antagonism translates into the idea that the historical model is always an antagonistic relationship between the oppressors and the oppressed, where the oppressors accumulate power by the exploitation of the oppressed. This idea will come up again in our reading of Nietzsche and the postmodernists. In fact, it's something of a mantra for both. When this ideology is translated into the racial basis for progress, it becomes a class struggle, not merely an individual one. An individual can become a criminal, but when the class becomes criminal, they are rebels, and rebels topple nations. The ultimate problem for Marx is the idea of private property. That lies at the root of the class separation. That is the method by which the proletariat are exploited and the means by which the bourgeoisie are enriched. The solution, for Marx, is to abolish private property in the bourgeoisie sense of private property as means of production. And that can only be done by revolution, by force, by oppressing the oppressors, because there is no other way. Marx nicely summarizes the point, quote, "You are horrified at our intending to do away with private property. But in your existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10. In one word, you reproach us with intending to do away with your property." The communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at the communist revolution. The proletariat have nothing to lose but their chains. They have the world to win. Now we have the Hegelian dialectic in a way that makes sense. It's not some mystical force that gives us progress, it's raw power. And Marx thinks that there is enough power to realize the kind of progress that will end history and usher in an era where the class struggle, which has been true for all of human existence, will finally end. Though a rather different approach, the Marxist conclusion is very Hegelian and signals the same kind of an end of history, with the progress attained at the highest level. We will not be guided there by the world spirit. We will violently fight and kill our way to that utopian conclusion. And that's fine, because evil is justified in the service of progress.